Today, we're going to be flying in a World War II trainer glider. Stay tuned. Welcome once again to Captain Fred's Aviation Theater. Today, we're at the Torrey Pines Glider Port in La Jolla, California. And with us is Doug Fronius, who is the owner and pilot of this World War II trainer glider. Doug, would you tell our viewers what this glider was used for?
This glider was used during World War II for training pilots at 29 Palms, California in the Army Air Corps, who did their primary training in this glider and then went on to fly large combat invasion gliders in Europe and the Far East during World War II.
So they didn't train in this to fly airplanes.
No.
They trained in this to fly gliders.
To fly large gliders.
Mm-hmm. The glider school, as they called it, was located at, what was it, 29 Palms?
29 Palms, California, which today is a major Marine Corps base.
And that base was at a desert sand when a young fella from here at Torrey Pines went over and took it over. Do you know that story?
Well, the school was started by local civilian, Southern California civilian soaring pilots who were contracted by the Army Air Corps to set up a soaring school. And some of those pilots, in particular Johnny Robinson, did fly at Torrey Pines prior to World War II.
And the commander of that base was a second lieutenant named Robert Cardenas. And he went to school here in San Diego and flew here at Torrey Pines, and then they put him in charge of that glider school out there. And later on, he became the test pilot for the Flying Wing.
Yes.
And he was the man who dropped Chuck Yeager from a B-29 when he broke the sound barrier. So people who fly gliders are not just glider pilots, they can do other things.
Right.
Okay. Tell our viewers how you hook up this glider and how it flies. There's a hook in the nose.
Yes.
Start with that, please.
Well, this is a conventional glider, just like the modern ones we fly today, even though it's 60 years old. It has a hook in the nose, and that hook is hooked to the end of a rope or a cable, and the other end of that cable can be attached to an airplane. That's called an aero tow, or it can be attached to a car.
Aero tow is one with an airplane.
With an airplane.
And auto tow is with a car.
And the third way would be with a winch.
With a winch, which is what you use here.
Which is what we use at Torrey Pines.
Which is a giant fishing reel.
Like a giant powered fishing reel that pulls you in.
Now, there is one other method that Hermann Göring's glider clubs used in Germany. Would you tell our viewers about that?
Well, that's called a bungee launch, and it was very common in the 1920s and 30s. In Germany in the 1920s, due to the treaty provisions of the Treaty of Versailles from World War I, they were not allowed to fly powered aircraft in Germany. So they developed pilots, anyone who wanted to fly flew gliders. In order to launch the gliders, since they didn't have aircraft, they would take them to the top of a hill, attach some very stretchy rope, like a rubber band, although it's stretchy rope actually, to the nose hook, and have a crew of men run down the hill pulling on the rope while securing the glider by the tail. And at the point where the rope was stretched to its maximum, release the glider and it would be catapulted into the air and then glide down into the valley below, or if they're lucky, find some lift and continue a longer flight.
And a flight would be maybe a minute, maybe 2 minutes?
Maybe a minute or two, and they were training flights. And often pilots would learn to fly solo first flight by that method with their instructor running along beside them, possibly with the bungee launch only stretched partially back so they skidded down the hill rather than flying down the hill until they learned to fly better.
Now that shock card or bungee card method was in a primary glider. Would you tell our viewers what a primary glider is?
A primary glider is the most basic of training gliders, very common in the 1920s and 30s. It had a fuselage, which was a complete open framework, and the pilot sat out on the front, not unlike some modern ultralights are today. Not very streamlined, it didn't glide very good, but you did your primary instruction in it.
Only the wing and the tail was covered.
That's correct.
I learned to fly in gliders, as you know, and my instructor learned to fly with Hermann Göring in one of his glider clubs.
Okay.
And he later flew ME-109s on the Russian front and was an ace in the German Air Force.
Wow.
Most of the glider pilots who learned to fly with Göring went right into the Luftwaffe.
Well, that was how they trained their pilots in Germany during World War II. All pilots did their initial training in gliders.
Now, you use a winch tow here, which is like a giant fishing reel.
Yes.
And what is the power at the other end?
The power for that winch is a Chevy V8, and it has a Power Glide automatic transmission. And it is a old winch that has been with the Associated Glider Clubs here in Southern California for decades and continues to be maintained and refurbished to use at Torrey Pines.
And what kind of a rope or cable do you use?
Say steel armored cable rolling up on the drum on the winch. Steel armored cable is good because we drag it across the ground, and any other kind of cable would wear out easily.
Like polypropylene or something like that would wear out quickly?
It would be fine in the air, but it would wear out dragging on the ground.
When you take off here, you're right on the cliffs over the ocean. When you take off here, you take off at a very steep angle.
Yes.
Would you tell our viewers about the takeoff, or the launch, as you call it?
Well, the launch on a winch in a sailplane is the closest thing to a catapult launch off of a Navy ship you can do in a glider, in that instead of a slow, leisurely acceleration behind an aircraft, the winch accelerates quickly, and you're airborne in just a couple of seconds, and immediately rotate to a steep angle, possibly 45 degrees, and climb up to the release height. It happens very quickly, and you can gain altitude very soon.
Then you release the cable.
Yes.
It has a little parachute on it.
Yes, to keep it from tangling.
And it falls back down.
Right.
And then you've got somebody on a motor, scooter, something that runs it back up here for the next one.
It takes quite a crew to operate a glider launch on a winch, so club members have to go pick up that cable and hook it to their car and drive it back to the start line and get ready for another launch.
Okay. Before we talk about the performance of this particular glider, I want to go back just for a moment to the very beginning, back to 1880, Otto Lilienthal, John J. Montgomery. Would you tell our viewers what the original, very first gliders in the world were like?
Well, the first gliders were very similar to the concept of a hang glider, in that you picked the glider up, ran down a hill, and launched yourself and glided to the bottom. Otto Lilienthal in Germany was the first to extensively glide and document his experiments. In fact, he had a hill specially built just for launching gliders in his hometown, which was several hundred feet high. The gliders that Otto Lilienthal flew were monoplanes, a single-wing aircraft, and looked very much like a bird in its design because that's what they were copying to develop the glider, and they controlled them by shifting weight, similar to some hang gliders today.
Then John J. Montgomery, right here in San Diego County, he launched his hang gliders from hot air balloons.
John J. Montgomery, who was from San Diego County, did do hot air balloon drops with hang gliders, with gliders, not hang gliders. Actually, those drops weren't made in San Diego County, but Montgomery was from here. They were mostly made up in Santa Clara area.
It was at county fairs or something like that, wasn't it?
And he had a pilot who flew for him. His name escapes me at the moment, and they would hook the glider with the pilot under a hot air balloon, climb up to altitude, release, and do an aerobatic demonstration until he landed back on the ground at the fair. And this was in the period around 1905, 1906 he was doing this.
So we started with that, the pioneers, and then in the early 30s, the Germans had glider clubs with the shock card launches. And here in the United States, primarily, I guess, here in San Diego, there were early gliders because Charles Lindbergh's wife learned to fly in a glider here in San Diego.
She did. In fact, she was either the first or second woman to receive a glider pilot's license in the U.S. Charles Lindbergh, when he came to San Diego to Ryan Airlines to have them build his Spirit of St. Louis monoplane, discovered that there was one of the key employees, Harley Bolus, worked for Ryan.
Oh, Bolus, I know that name.
And he was the foreman of the shop that built the wing for the Spirit of St. Louis. And he became good friends with Charles Lindbergh, and Bolus, after hours, flew gliders. That was his hobby, design, built, and flew gliders. And so Lindbergh came back to San Diego after he was famous, after his flight, and flew with Harley Bolus at Point Loma and off of Mount Soledad. And on one flight in particular, launched at Mount Soledad and glided all the way to the beach in Del Mar. So it was one of the very earliest flights at Torrey Pines, although he didn't take off and land from here.
Now, if I remember, the Bolus had a pod with a boom.
That was one of his later designs from the late 30s, known as the Baby Bolus or Baby Albatross, and it was the most famous Bolus glider. The Boluses from the late 20s that Charles Lindbergh flew had more conventional fuselages, a long full cantilever wing, and were quite high performance in their day.
For our viewers, Anne Morrow Lindbergh, earned her glider license at Dutch Flats, which is just north of Lindbergh Airport, right?
Yes, they would use car tow. They had a glider equipped with landing gear similar to an aircraft so they could tow it around the ground and teach people to fly, as opposed to the European tradition of launching off of a hill with a bungee cord.
Doug, we've talked about the history of gliding. Now let's talk about this particular glider.
Okay.
Where did you get it and how?
Well, we actually bought it from Vancouver, Canada. There was a long history of the glider that got it to Vancouver, where it belonged to a club up there, and brought it back to San Diego. Going back to the beginning of its history, it was built in Elmira, New York at Schweitzer Aircraft Company and delivered to 29 Palms in June of 1942 to 29 Palms, California. It served during the war at 29 Palms, and then at the end of the war was sold surplus to the Walters brothers. And Fred and Carl Walters are still with us, and Carl lives in Escondido, and we've just talked a few days ago.
Did they buy it for a glider club?
They bought it for their own personal glider, and they flew it for around 20 years in the Southern California area, including many flights at Torrey Pines. They then sold the glider to, it went through a number of owners, including both clubs and private individuals, until in 1990 it ended up in Vancouver, Canada. I found through a friend that it was for sale, and my dad and I bought the glider and brought it back to San Diego and got it back flying in U.S. registration again.
Very good. Let's start at the very tip of the nose. It's fabric covered.
It's fabric covered, the entire aircraft.
And what is the frame made out of?
The fuselage frame is made out of steel tubing, so it's very sturdy. And the wings and the tail are made out of aircraft aluminum with fabric covering.
So it's not wood?
It's not a wooden glider. In fact, the Schweitzer Company during the 1930s was known as the Schweitzer Metal Aircraft Company.
Oh, is that right?
They were proud of building only metal aircraft.
So the ribs and everything is aluminum?
It's an aluminum aircraft with a steel tube fuselage.
But it is fabric covered?
Yes.
The leading edge is fabric, just painted metallic?
It's the leading edge is fabric over the aluminum structure, and it's painted metallic. The original aircraft, the leading edges were left bare aluminum, bare shiny aluminum. But this one, being 60 years old, had quite a few scuffed areas and repaired areas, and we elected to paint it just for appearance.
What about the cockpit? Tell us about that.
Well, it's a two-place tandem cockpit.
Tandem is front and back. And does the student sit in the front and the instructor in the back?
The student can sit in the front and the instructor in the back. That would be the normal arrangement for initial training. You can fly it from either seat. I often give rides with the passenger in the front so they have a nicer view. Somewhat depends on the passenger and the pilot's weight also.
The controls are just like an airplane.
Controls are exactly like an aircraft, except you don't have a throttle.
You have a stick for the elevator and the ailerons, and you have a pedal, two pedals for the rudder, left and right. And in the back, it's dual control.
Yes.
Now, there is one thing that this has that an airplane doesn't have.
Well,
it's a release.
It has a release. And that's the release that unhooks you from either the tow plane or the tow car or the winch.
So when we see them hooking the cable up at the nose of the glider, after you get up in the air, you pull the release and it opens up and the cable falls away.
Yeah, the pilot has control of when he unhooks from the tow.
What kind of instrumentation does it have?
This glider has basic instrumentation. It has an airspeed indicator, an altimeter, a compass, and some form of a rate of climb, which is very sensitive.
Okay, let's go over those again slower.
Okay,
First one is
an airspeed indicator.
An airspeed indicator.
Yes.
Mm-hmm. And it cruises at what, 30?
It cruises at 35 to 45.
Mm-hmm. And what was the next one?
An altimeter.
An altimeter, so you know how high you are.
So you know how high you are.
And what was the other one? A climb indicator?
It does have a compass.
A compass,
yes,
for cross-country work.
For cross-country.
Mm-hmm.
And it has a climb indicator. And climb is very important in gliders. You want to know if you're going up in lift, so it has a very sensitive climb indicator known as a variometer.
Now, does this have a piece of yarn taped on the front?
It also has a piece of yarn for the rear seat pilot and the front seat pilot on the top of the canopy, and that's a skid and slip indicator.
It's a high-tech instrument.
It's a heads-up display.
Yeah. Then moving back to the back seat,
yes,
where the instructor would sit, or if you're giving a ride,
right,
the pilot would sit. First thing I see there is the release lever.
You have release in both cockpits.
Now, I'm surprised because you have instruments in the back seat, too.
Yes.
That's unusual.
Well, some gliders, the two-seat, have only instruments in the front. This one, the front seat is so far forward, it's very difficult to see those instruments from the back, and it was normal to have also a panel in the back for the instructor. It makes it a little more convenient for giving rides from the back seat.
You know what? There's something else this has that an airplane doesn't have. Most airplanes, and that's spoilers.
It has spoilers.
Because I just saw the spoiler lever there. Would you tell our viewers about spoilers, because there's a scientific principle involved?
Well, I hadn't thought of it as scientific before, but a glider, by its design, glides quite well. In an aircraft, if you pull the throttle back, slow down the engine, it comes down fairly rapidly.
You sink.
You sink. Mm-hmm. But in a glider, it's designed to glide well, and it does not come down very easily, and it makes controlling exactly where your touchdown point is somewhat difficult. To fix that, just about all gliders and sailplanes have what are called spoilers, and they are a device on the wing which spoils the airflow so that it
spoils the lift.
Spoils the lift, mm-hmm, so that it then glides like an aircraft with the engine off. So
less well.
Less well, so you can control where you're going to touch down very accurately.
I was taught that you can lose altitude by putting the nose down, but that will increase your speed.
Yes.
So by using the spoiler, you can lose altitude without increasing your speed.
That's correct.
So the function of the spoiler is for you to lose altitude without increasing speed by putting the nose down. I've seen gliders. A glider with spoiler, you can actually fly like this, with the spoilers off and on, like a pogo stick. It's that sensitive.
Open them and close them, yes.
Mm-hmm. And as far as sensitivity or how accurate it is, you can literally land a glider on a bed sheet.
You have great control over where you touch down.
I've seen the competitions that you have here.
Yes.
First, second, and third are within a foot.
That's correct. For spot landing contests.
You can come within 12 inches and take third place.
Yeah. So gliders typically are more accurate on their ability to spot land than a powered aircraft. It's easier to control them to a precision landing.
You mentioned the compass on this.
Yes.
If you were doing a cross-country flight, what kind of a glide ratio would you expect?
Well, this glider, by modern standards, is rather poor. It's about an 18-to-1 glide ratio. And some modern high-performance sailplanes are above 60-to-1, to give you an idea, more than 3 times flatter glide.
But this was designed for training.
It was designed for training, and it was designed about 65 years ago and built 60 years ago.
But it did what it was designed to do very well.
Yes, and it can fly cross-country. There have been flights made in these gliders of approaching 300 miles in distance.
What else would you like to tell our viewers about yourself or about the glider?
Well, I'm not sure anything else about the glider. There are a couple of small facts about this glider that we find interesting. It was based, as I mentioned, at 29 palms. The military records, which we've been able to acquire from the Air Force, show that it flew 1,300 hours of military time in only a year and a half at 29 palms. To the best of our knowledge, that is the highest time military glider that is flying today.
It didn't gather dust.
It didn't gather dust. It has about 3,000 hours on it today, so it flew 1,300 hours in the first 18 months, and then in the next 60 years flew 1,700 hours. It gathered a little bit of dust in civilian hands. Another small piece of its history that you might find interesting: when the glider was flown here at the Torrey Pines meets in the 1950s and 60s, there were large soaring championships here at Torrey Pines with many participants. It was a major event.
Women too.
And of course.
Mm-hmm.
And
well, I mean, it wasn't a chauvinistic activity.
No.
Because I know Helen Dick,
yes,
who set a lot of world championships.
Sure.
Mm-hmm.
But one of the features of these meets in the 50s and 60s was they always had a meet queen of the meet for the glider club at that time. And this glider was used to fly, give a ride to the queen of one of the meets in the early 60s, and it was Raquel Welch.
Ah,
so
Raquel
Welch
Tejeda
has flown in this glider when
Excellent.
she was at Torrey Pines.
A good note to close on.
So that's a good closer.
Thank you for being with us. As always, this is Captain Fred saying, I love airplanes and I honor the people who fly them. Today, we've been visiting with Doug Fronius at the Torrey Pines Glider Port at La Jolla, California.
Yeah, that's fine. To get in with one hand is hard.
Yeah.
Okay, now come around. Nope.